All right, welcome back, everyone. So in this part, part two of our lecture, what we'll be looking at now are alpha motor neurons, motor units, and then we'll begin to get into some functional anatomy of the brain. So looking at some specific regions of the brain, some specific regions of the cortex, and what those regions of the brain do. So starting off here with alpha motor neurons. Now we left off in the previous part by discussing intrafusal muscle fibers, and we mentioned gamma motor neurons and then alpha motor neurons and extrafusal muscle fibers. So these alpha motor neurons, we said that they're going to innervate extrafusal fibers. So those are the fibers that actually contract whenever you're performing a movement, right? So if you're working out and you're lifting weights, the muscle fibers that are contracting in the muscle are the extrafusal muscle fibers, and so those are innervated by alpha motor neurons. So again, begin to associate alpha motor neuron with extrafusal fiber, gamma motor neuron with intrafusal fiber, right? So these alpha motor neurons, they can be a part of what's referred to as a motor unit, right? And what a motor unit is a single neuron and all of the muscle fibers that it innervates, right? So you can see here, you have one neuron in blue, right? So you can trace one neuron. So you have this one lower motor neuron, alpha motor neuron, and it goes and innervates 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 muscle fibers, right? So that altogether, all the fibers and the one neuron, that is a motor unit, right? Now, in the body, you have different size motor units, okay? You have large motor units, you have small motor units. What this means is, what makes it large or small is the number of muscle fibers that are being innervated by that one neuron, right? So if you have a large motor unit, you have lots and lots of muscle fibers being innervated by a single motor neuron. If you have a small motor unit, you have very few muscle fibers being innervated by, again, a single motor neuron, okay? So what this means, and it's somewhat intuitive whenever you think about it, that the smaller the unit, the more precise control you have over the activity that those muscles with that neuron perform, right? So if you have a single neuron, motor neuron, innervating just a few muscle fibers, you can have very fine, precise control of those muscles, and so thus you get a very fine, precise movement, right, or activity. Whereas if you had a very large motor unit, right, you had one neuron with 100 muscle fibers or 50 or something like that, more than the previous, then you get more gross movement. You have less control, less fine precision and precise movements with that group of muscles, right? So take, for instance, your gastrocnemius, right? Your gastrocnemius is what we typically refer to as just the calf, right? It's your calf muscle. And this is a relatively large muscle that is innervated by a large motor unit. So meaning there are neurons that come to the gastrocnemius, innervate it, and those neurons innervate lots of muscle fibers within that muscle itself, okay? Now, you can also have very small motor units, and this allows for very fine, precise control, right? So think of young children, think of elderly adults moving some type of object, whether it's like this image in the left, you're picking up some small rock or something, you're playing blocks, you're moving things on a game board, right? The ability to move things precisely and with fine precision requires a very fine-tuned motor unit, right? Now, we know that young children don't have the same ability that adults have to finely control their muscles, right? Just look at a child's handwriting, right? It is typically not as good as an adult's handwriting, right? Now, that's not to say that all adults' handwriting is good. Take my handwriting, for instance. My handwriting is absolutely dreadful. But the idea is still the same. As we age and as we get older, to some degree, we're able to have more control over our motor units, and thus we're able to have more fine, precise movements of those muscles, and thus those actions that the muscles produce, right? So along with these lower motor neurons, they also interact with a neuron that is called an interneuron, right? Now, an interneuron, hence its name, is a neuron that is it is between two other neurons, and those neurons can be sensory and motor neurons, so it's in between those two, or it could be in between one motor neuron and another motor neuron, right? So in the example of the upper motor neurons and the lower motor neurons. In between, you have an interneuron, right? So they allow communication and relay of impulses between. And they also help with complex movements and complex motor pathways. So this pathway that you see to the left, we'll talk about this more later with our Golgi tendon organ. And this organ in general, for now, you can know that it's just monitoring tension of the muscle. But there is an important role that the interneuron plays, a couple of interneurons play in this pathway, to help us be able to contract certain muscles while at the same time being able to relax other muscles, right? And this is coordinated and this is accomplished via the action of interneurons, okay? So you can see here in these pathways, or in this bottom pathway, you have an interneuron. So you have the black neuron here, right? So this is your first neuron. You have this small interneuron in between, and then this neuron coming out is another motor neuron. So this would be sensory neuron, this would be interneuron, and then this would be motor neuron coming out. And you note that that interneuron is in between the sensory and the motor, right? So in this case, it says it's an inhibitory neuron. This would be inhibiting the activity of this motor neuron here, this motor neuron that's coming out. And so this would be causing relaxation or preventing contraction of this muscle belly right here, right? We'll come back to this image and talk about these in a little while, right? So when we talk about the brain now, we've talked about neurons and we'll come back to them, but when we talk about the brain itself is divided into lobes. It's divided into hemispheres, and those hemispheres are divided into lobes, and those lobes can be divided into specific regions with different cortical regions. And different regions of the brain have different functions, right? And so damage to a region of the brain results in a loss of some function because that part of the brain was carrying out some type of function, right? And so we said that in the spinal cord, there's this somatotopic organization, somatotopic arrangement. We see something very similar in the brain as we saw whenever we looked at the homunculus, right? So we'll talk about these different cortical regions and discuss some functions, and we'll give some examples of some different ways that you can understand their function, right? So in general, what we're talking about is the motor cortex, right? Now there are different cortical regions associated with motor activity, and that's what we'll talk about. So in general, motor cortex is referring to a region or a grouping of areas that are all involved with voluntary muscle movement, right? So you can see to the left, you have what's called the primary motor cortex, supplementary motor area, premotor cortex. You have a posterior parietal cortex, primary somatosensory cortex, so on and so on, all right? So the main cortex, the kind of main one that we discussed is called the is the primary motor cortex, this one in purple that you see here. And this is located in a gyrus known as the precentral gyrus, right? So if a question or if you're asked or you're reading about the structural region of the brain, the structural region is the precentral gyrus, okay? You're describing the structure. If you're describing the function of the gyrus, the functional region, that would be the primary motor cortex, right? So there's these two that go together, and we'll refer to them both. We'll primarily, however, refer to the primary motor cortex because we're talking about the functional aspects of the brain, okay? So as these neurons that are in these regions, as they begin to travel down the brainstem, spinal cord, at some point, they have to undergo what's called decussation. And all decussation is crossing over, right? You're on one side of the brain, one side of the brainstem, one side of the spinal cord. You have to go to the other side, the opposite side, and thus you cross over, you decussate, right? Now, we'll see that in different motor pathways, the decussation occurs at different regions. Some it occurs higher up in the brainstem and spinal cord. Some it occurs lower down within the spinal cord. You should remember decussation from spinal ascending pathways in the central nervous system, because in the ascending pathways, we also had decussation as well. We had crossing over from one side to the next, all right? So if you damage one side of the brain, it's likely to have deficits on the opposite side of the body, right? So if somebody has a stroke, they've damaged one region of their brain, it happened to be a region of the brain associated with motor activity, they may see deficits on the opposite side. So they have right-sided weakness, they can't move their hand, arm, something like that. there may be a left-sided stroke, something like that, okay? So here you can see 4 different regions of decussation. So you see regions of decussation occurring here, right? We're going down, we're crossing over. Same thing here, crossing over. Come over to this side, right? We started, we came down, and we crossed over. And then same thing here, we came down, and we crossed over, right? When you cross over, the upper motor neuron is then going to synapse onto a lower motor neuron, and that lower motor neuron is then going to leave the central nervous system, go out into the periphery, innervate some effector, in this case, probably some type of muscle, all right? So let's talk about some actual brain regions, shall we? So first one that we'll talk about is called the premotor cortex, right? The premotor cortex, and all these that we'll discuss when we do this lecture, none of them are working independently, all right? We'll talk about them independently. We'll say that they have some function, but they're all working together for some general function, some common function, some common purpose, right? So premotor cortex. Premotor cortex is in front of the primary motor cortex, right? Hence its name premotor, all right? So here's your primary motor cortex in purple. Right here's your premotor cortex in yellow, all right? So this coordinates activity, motor activity along with the primary motor cortex. This region is also thought to help plan the actual motor activity. So it's not the one that's initiating the activity, but it's helping to plan the activity of the neurons and then relay that plan to the primary motor cortex, and then from the cortex it can go down, all right? Now this region can also, this region of the brain can also help you respond to visual and auditory cues, all right? So you see here the example of monkeys and peanuts. So what am I talking about? So there was a study that was done where they took monkeys and they presented them with different stimuli, all right? One of them, they gave monkeys, and they had electrodes hooked up to the brain of the monkey, and they were monitoring electrical activity. And they gave a monkey a peanut and had the monkey break the peanut, and when it broke the peanut, there was an electrical spike. There was some electrical activity in the brain in response to the monkey cracking the peanut, getting the nut, and eating it, all right? They gave some monkeys, or they had some other monkeys in a room. There was a person in the room, and the person, the human, was cracking the nuts. And what they saw was that the electrical activity in the monkey, in the brain, it spiked. There was activity in the same region of the brain as before, whenever the monkey itself was cracking the nuts, right? So far we have monkeys cracking nuts. You get a spike in electrical activity in a certain region. You have humans cracking the nuts. You get a spike in electrical activity in the same region. And then third, what they did is they played a sound of a nut being cracked, and same thing. You get a spike in electrical activity in a specific region of the brain, same as the previous two, right? So whether it was the monkey cracking it, the monkey watching the human crack it, or the monkey just hearing the sound of the nut being cracked, there was a spike in electrical activity in the same region of the brain, right? Now, you also have this region function in learned activities. So learned activities that involve some type of sequential, not necessarily sequential, but some type of some type of activity that requires memory, all right? So whether you're tying your shoe or you're riding your bike or playing the piano, something where you have learned this motor activity, this initial activity can be initiated in this premotor cortex, right? So you can see here in blue, you have your primary motor cortex, and just in front of that in green, you have your premotor cortex, right? Now, there's another region called the supplementary motor area, right? Now, the supplementary motor area helps to control sequential muscle activity or sequential muscle movements, right? So a great example of this is walking, right? The gait cycle in walking, you have a number of different phases, right? You have to dorsiflex the toe, you have to flex the hip, extend the knee, you have to heel strike, you plantar flex, you do all these different things that allow you to walk. This activity of walking is initiated, the plan for it is initiated in the supplementary motor area, all right? Think of throwing a baseball, right? Throwing anything or kicking something is a very sequential activity. You have to go through a series of steps, motor activities, and then at the end of that sequence, you get some result, you release the ball, all right? Now, another one that is immediately testable, or something you can do yourself, and that we'll do, or you should follow along to my instructions, is the movement of your fingers, right? So hold your right hand up and spread your fingers apart as if you were showing somebody the number 5, right? So you have your hand up, your fingers are spread apart. Take your thumb and your pinky, so your 5th digit, bring those together and touch them together and then release them, right? So you have your thumb, your pinky, you bring them together, touch it, release it, and then do the same thing with your 4th finger, so your ring finger, to your thumb. Bring them together, touch it. Same thing with your 3rd finger, your middle finger, touch it. And then same thing with your 2nd finger or your index finger, touch it to your thumb, right? And then start over and do it fast. So go thumb to pinky, thumb to ring finger, thumb to middle finger, thumb to index finger, and then back, right? And then you can do it with your other hand, and then you can do the 2 hands together, right? So you can go thumb to pinky on both hands, thumb to ring finger, thumb to middle finger, thumb to index finger, and then back. You can do this very easily, right? And you can go from starting at the pinky, starting at the index finger, doesn't matter. This is a very sequential process, right? And so this is being initiated and being controlled by the supplementary motor area, all right? Now, there's another region called the association area, or association areas, or cortices. And these are what are called the prefrontal cortex and the posterior parietal association cortex, right? So the prefrontal, this one in red, this is where our thought or our idea to do some type of motor activity, this is where this thought is initiated, right? So it's making sure that our movement or our plan for movement is appropriate, right? And so as we'll see later, we don't just automatically send a motor signal down the brain out to the muscle. We send it to different regions of the brain for different checks and to control it and modify it, that being the signal, and then send it out to the periphery, right? Now, you also have the parietal association cortex, which again, it helps with very precise movements and allows the somatosensory cortex to communicate with other motor cortices that are in different parts of the region. So again, you have this blue one here, parietal association cortex, this red one in front, prefrontal cortex, right? So we'll stop here with our motor cortex regions, and then we'll pick up in part 3, the next part, by discussing the brainstem.